It's Kevin and Jesse from Grab Them by the Pod.
And you're listening to Vaguely Accurate on the ACE Podcast Network.
ACE Podcast.
Winter is coming. Or is that global warming? Hello everyone, I'm your host DK and you're listening to Vaguely Accurate, the science show where we explain the seemingly complex simply. Now today we are joined by Ashely Cooper, a pro photographer dedicated to capturing and documenting the impact of global warming across the world. Ashely's images have won him the climate change category of the Environmental Photographer of the Year competition in 2010. And what's spectacular about Ashely's approach is that he doesn't just document the physical changes to the Earth. He also strives to highlight the impact of these changes to society and how innovators across the world are leading the charge to develop environmentally friendly technology. Firstly, thank you very much for joining us on the show and bearing with all the technical difficulties. So could you tell us a little bit more about yourself? And including that, could you also say what has started this lifelong dedication of yours?
Yeah, I've been an environmental photographer for around about the last 20 years. And maybe about 14, 15 years ago, I started reading more about climate change. And at that time, it was something a lot of people hadn't really heard about. But for me as an environmental photographer, it sounded like an interesting subject area. So I started doing quite a lot of research, and it seemed that at the time Alaska was an area that was really being quite badly affected by it. So my research led me to believe that there was a problem with permafrost melt, with glacial retreat, with spruce bark beetles that didn't used to be able to survive in Alaskan winter that were spreading further north and killing off millions of acres of boreal forest. And this just sounded fascinating. So I planned a month-long trip there. And for me, the highlight of that trip was spending a week on a tiny little island called Shishmaref, a remote island between Alaska and Siberia, home to 600 Inuits. And their houses were just getting washed into the sea because the sea ice that used to form maybe late September time, even 14, 15 years ago, wasn't forming till Christmas time. So if they had a bad storm came through before the sea ice formed, it was knocking chunks out their island and washing their houses into the sea.
That's horrible.
It was just incredible, and I learned something there for the first time that I've just seen so many times since, and that is, those least responsible for climate change are most impacted by it. As hunter-gatherers, their carbon footprint was tiny, and yet they were being, affected by it in just the most monumental way.
Did they have an understanding of what was happening there, or are they very much like the traditional Aboriginals that are here in Australia, and they've got their own culture and their own understanding through stories and their own beliefs?
A little bit of a mix of both, I would say. I mean, even then, they had quite a clear understanding of what climate change was. Certainly, they could see with their own eyes that their environment and their climate was changing very rapidly, and they knew exactly what the problem was. And they were doing a lot of campaigning around it at the time, trying to get people to listen to them and say, look, this thing is altering our world. Something needs to be done about it. But at the time, very few people were listening.
Has that changed at all since? Like, are more people listening to them now?
I suspect under the current administration, probably in terms of those with any power, a fewer are probably listening. But certainly, the residents of Shishmaref about 6 months ago now actually took the historic step to, as a community, they voted to leave the island that had been their home for thousands of years because it's just not sustainable any longer. And I know one of the things that the Trump administration has done is absolutely slashed the budget that in the past did give some support to remote communities in the Arctic and help them tackle the worst effects of the erosion on their barrier islands that was happening. So their problems are just getting worse and worse.
So there are traveling the world as you have done. Has this all been a privately funded venture for you?
It has, yeah. I mean, it's completely self-funded on the back of image sales at a time, 14, 15 years ago when I was selling a lot of images into the media. I still am today. The difference is the price for images has just collapsed. So 40, 15 years ago, you could get reasonable rates for images, and if you were selling enough of them, it gave me enough of a budget to fund a lot of the expensive overseas photo shoots that I did. And so, the vast majority of the project was funded through the sale of the images that I was taking on these trips.
And you on that, I think it's an appropriate time just to throw in your plug-in that I'd like you to do. But you're an author of a spectacular book that I've been going through and is on my to buy. It's in the cart right now. But Images for a Warming Planet, which is I suppose an encyclopedia of images that's documenting just the effect of global warming globally.
Yeah, I spent 13 years traveling to every continent on the planet, documenting both the impacts of climate change and also some of the solutions around that, the renewable technologies. And the book Images from a Warming Planet has got 500 of the best images from my last sort of 13, 14 years work documenting climate change all around the world, really.
I strongly encourage anyone listening to go check out globalwarmingimages.net. There is an online gallery of images up there that are just spectacular to even have a look at, with a huge array of categories. Did you say it's been taking you 13 years to get an archive this big?
Yeah, about 13 years that I've spent traveling around the world, recording all the impacts of climate change.
Now, I've got. What would you say? Could we get two extremes from you? What would you say, in your experiences over that time, is the most heartbreaking scene you've witnessed? But also, to bring a bit of life back, what's the most uplifting example of innovation or human resolve?
I think certainly. I've probably seen more images of kind of planetary destruction and environmental destruction than anybody else on the planet. And certainly for me, it always comes back to the human story, whether that's people whose lives have been ripped apart in Australia with, catastrophic bushfires, whether it's Inuits whose houses have been washed into the sea, or people all around the world been impacted by devastating floods or droughts. For me, it's always that human story. The migrants currently, absolutely flooding into Europe from places like Syria. Essentially, they're climate change migrants, because what kicked off all the wars around the Mediterranean, really, the Arab Spring, was a rise in price at markets of food, and that rise in price was caused by the ongoing drought in North Africa. So, when you see literally millions of people now moving around the planet because the areas that they used to live in can no longer sustain them, that's kind of pretty hard to see, really. But certainly some of the more uplifting things I've seen was on a photo shoot that I did to India, where I was looking at how renewable technologies were helping to uplift some very poor communities out of poverty and giving them access to electricity for the first time. So they could exchange the kind of horrible polluting kerosene lamp that they had in their hut for a light bulb because they got a little solar panel on their roof. Fantastic things to see.
That's spectacular.
And places like the Barefoot College, where they're taking women from poor communities all around the world and teaching them how to build solar cookers and solar lanterns. And that's just really uplifting to see. And there was an ashram I visited in India that was 100% powered by renewables, and they had the world's first solar crematorium, which I just thought was amazing.
That's amazing. The innovation and technology. The human endeavor with the world as it is, there are so many countries that are still to undergo or currently undergoing that development stage, which was funded by or fueled by coal for the current countries like the USA and the UK. And it's great to see that there are people out there using the technology and the knowledge that we've learned in being more advanced to fuel their endeavors. That's spectacular.
It is great to see. And you look at how rapidly things are changing now. I did a photo shoot to China about 10 years ago. And at the time, China was seen as the big meanie in the climate change world because they were building a new coal-fired power station every week. But now that, large parts of China have been devastated by climate change, and now the Chinese are saying that, hey, this is a big problem. It's impacting them. And very recently, they announced that they are putting $350 billion into renewable energy in the next 20 years. So they're really leading the world in the way to power communities in a clean, green, renewable way, which is fantastic to see.
That's amazing. Like, one of the images that stood out to me most, it wasn't like the most scenic or picturesque, but I think it was a radiation therapy machine in India that was completely either solar powered or renewably energy powered.
Yeah, that's on the ashram, and yeah, they've got a lot of solar panels. They use biofuel from some of the wood reserves that they've got. They make their own biogas from waste food products, and the whole thing. You go into this ashram and they provide services from cradle to grave. So they've got schools there for young children, for older children. They've got old people's homes. They've got this specialist cancer hospital with equipment that would not look out of place in some swanky hospital in New York, and all of it is powered by renewable energy, which really is quite incredible.
That is, with your I suppose first-hand experience, I think you're more than equipped to answer this question, more so than any. But what would you say are the biggest challenges we face with climate change, whether it be to reverse the effect or simply to adapt to climate change?
I think the biggest challenge is to get people to take climate change seriously, because for a lot of people, they're maybe only just starting to see the problems that might cause them, maybe increased flooding or drought, but it's such a large scale of a problem that I think a lot of people think, well, me as an individual, what can I do about that? And that is a huge problem. We can all do, a lot of different things to lower our own carbon footprints. But more importantly, I think we need to act collectively. We need to put a lot more pressure on our political leaders. We have to be optimistic. The Paris Agreement was just an incredible agreement where, the vast majority of the world's countries came together and said, look, we need to tackle this. But, and they set themselves a target of trying to keep within, 1.5 degrees of warming. And at the moment, we're looking kind of like we're going to miss that. So we just need greater efforts by many of the countries involved to drive their carbon footprints down. And the reality is people just aren't putting the money into it that it needs to tackle the scale of the problem. And yet all the research shows us is the price of tackling climate change is a fraction of the cost that we will incur if we do not tackle it.
Yeah. Yeah, like you said, the cost to actually tackle climate change once the damage is done, it's no longer tackling it as an oncoming threat. It's adapting to it and trying to develop technologies for us or the environment to kind of live in the way it should.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, the insurance industry is one of the industries that is really keen on tackling climate change, because they see in a warming world, their business model is just going to go out the window. They will no longer have a viable business. And to give you one example, in the US alone last year, there were 15 extreme weather events that cost the insurance industry over $1 billion a time. Well, wow. Some of these insurance industries have got quite deep pockets, but you start taking billions of pounds out of them, and very rapidly their pot of money is running out. So they can see that unless something happens quite rapidly, that they're just no longer going to be in business.
And with that noise, it's time to give a short shout out to those Vaguely Accurate supports. Vaguely Accurate supports Sabre, the Staffy and Bully Breed rescue organisation, which is entirely run by volunteers who are dedicated to improving the image of bull breeds and educating the public about what wonderful family companions they can be. They take the responsibility of matching dogs with the right home seriously, and dogs adopted directly through Sabre are wormed, fleed, treated, vaccinated, microchipped, sterilised, and vet checked. They do a fantastic job. I'm a foster carer for them, and that little bark you heard, jumping straight into this segment, was Scrappy. I'll post a photo up. He is the cutest little puppy. We had him recently, and he got adopted to his new family, which is fantastic. But if you could check them out at www.sabre.com, that's SABBR, or just click on the link in the description, and just see what they're about, just spreading the awareness of responsible pet ownership and rescue dogs. There might be an organisation near you if you're thinking about a dog that does a similar thing. It's still worth spreading the news. Let's get back into the show, guys. I'm loving this social, humanitarian perspective that you have upon, from traveling around. You don't often hear that. And you are correct. Acting as a collective, almost as a collective community or a single organism on the earth, can make a significant difference if we just start making the right choices. It is harder with the current, trend of misinformation and fake news, which I won't go into. But like you said, it's just, you're a huge advocate for communicating the impacts of this, and that's inspirational in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many examples of where people have got together in their own communities to make life better for themselves. Just in the UK here, there's been a real growth in people coming together to fund renewable energy projects, whether that be a small-scale hydro project or a small wind farm, and where the benefit from that flows back into the community. So people have invested their own money to get these things built, but then a percentage of the profits goes back into the local community to help the local school, to help local charities. It's a win-win situation, and local communities have control over generating their own power, but they're also helping to improve the quality of life for everybody in their own communities by doing this. So there's so many different ways that people can get on board and help tackle the problem.
Now, I have a short list of direct and indirect environmental phenomena that are found across the globe as a result of global warming. If I was to go through this short list, could you give us an example of a personal experience that you've seen and tell us if it's in the book and where we can find it, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
So the first one we've got is sea level rise. Do you have any good, compelling images of sea level rise or anything to say on that?
I do. Being driven massively just by the melt of the great ice sheets and glaciers around the world now. And I did very early on in this project visit Tuvalu, which is a small independent country down in the Pacific, very remote area. I mean, more people climb Everest every year than visit Tuvalu. It's a small coral atoll island chain, and probably will be the first country to disappear as a result of climate change. And I visited there for the highest king tides of the year, and what I saw was truly shocking. I mean, on a flat, calm sea, we were not talking big storm waves swamping the island, but it was a flat, calm sea. But just the height the tides have got to at the highest tides of the year, on the main island, Funafuti, the island was 4 foot underwater in the middle. And that is just obviously utterly unsustainable.
That's terrible. Especially for an island that hardly anyone's even heard of it. I've never heard of that island, and it would just slowly disappear with very few publicity about it. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And, people were already having to leave the island. This is 10 or 12 years ago. And I mean, the situation will just be even worse now.
The next one would be global temperature rise, which is, I suppose, global warming in itself.
Yeah, I mean, there have been many examples. One of the things, I mean, the thing about global warming is that it is an average rise in the temperature of the planet, and some areas are getting a lot hotter. Actually, some areas are getting a bit cooler. But what is really dramatic is when you see the increase in some of the extreme hot heat wave events that we're getting. And there was a heat wave about 12 years ago that hit southern Europe, and quite a few tens of thousands of people died directly as a result of this heat wave, mainly young and very old people, where temperatures like rocketed to sort of 40, 45 degrees, temperatures that actually physically humans find quite difficult to cope with. And we're starting to see more and more of that across the world as these extreme heat waves become both more frequent and more aggressive.
I do remember that heat wave.
Yeah, these things are going to be knocking on more people's doorsteps, and people just need to wake up and understand, the dangers that we face, really.
So the next one would be a warming oceans. Do you have anything on that one?
Yeah, I looked at one of the big impacts on when the oceans get warmer is that it starts to impact on the coral reefs around the world. And the coral reefs are, a huge reservoir of biodiversity. They're the rainforests of the seas, really. And what happens when the seas get warmer is you get a phenomenon known as coral bleaching. The coral is a symbiotic relationship between a coral and an algae, and it's the algae that give the corals some of the beautiful colours that they have. And all corals are adapted to a certain sea temperature, and when that sea temperature gets beyond the limit that they are adapted to, it puts a lot of stress on the corals, and that stress causes the coral to eject the algae. So that's the colour goes out of the algae, essentially, hence the term coral bleaching. And at the moment, I documented coral bleaching actually on around Fiji and also on the Barrier Reef in Australia about 5 or 6 years ago now. But this year has been a devastating year for coral reefs around the world. Something like 80% of the Great Barrier Reef currently has been bleached.
It's terrible. It's terrible. It's always on the news over here. And there are still, like, a lot of Australians are very passionate about it, and they're kind of just like, look, we've got to do something about it. But the government for Australia tends to be in this almost slight state of denial about it.
It really is quite incredible because, these events have happened commonly in El Nino years in the past. And if the sea temperatures go back down, coral reefs can recover. But the trouble is, with climate change, the sea temperatures are rising and they're staying high. So the coral hasn't got a chance to recover from an extreme event. It is killing off coral all around the world, which is devastating for the biodiversity of the ocean. And also coral reefs provide other services to humanity in that they provide protection from storm waves and coastal erosion. But, if you remove those reefs, then it opens up coastlines to even greater erosion that they're already seeing with increased storm events.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure, I don't know if you know, but my field is oceanography, and it's one of those true passionate things that I just want to keep pushing out there. It's got really detrimental indirect effects that most people won't even consider. Like another one you mentioned was bushfires. And yes, it's not the heat necessarily, or the heat that actually sparks more bushfires. It's the longer period of warmth, which creates warmer winds and better meteorological conditions to induce fires that are actually the cause. It's not just the fact that there's more fuel for it as well.
Yeah, and of course that just, the warmer things get, and certainly areas are becoming more drought prone. If they dry out, then tinder dry conditions are just perfect for sparking bushfires.
Have you been to any areas that have actually, I suppose, transformed into a desert in recent years?
Yeah, when I was in China, I visited quite a lot of areas in Inner Mongolia where they used to support large numbers of people. It was never the most productive agricultural land, but people used to be able to have village reservoirs that filled up when it did rain. They could use those reservoirs to irrigate their crops, and they could grow enough food to support their family and would have a bit of excess to sell at market, and they could live quite happily in that way. And huge swathes of areas now in China have been abandoned where they've just got so dry that people can no longer grow crops, and they've just abandoned their villages and moved into cities. And you see the impacts of desertification. I travelled through areas where, forests were just being buried under massive sand dunes that were sweeping in as the area got drier, roads covered up by sand dunes sweeping in, and the whole thing is quite apocalyptic to see, really.
I can't wait to get this book so I can actually put real images to the stories that you're telling. It's really hard to imagine what you're describing just abstractly. Like, it kind of, like you said, it sounds very apocalyptic, and I don't know how to scale that.
Yeah, and I'm a photographer. I'm a visual communicator, and people have said to me the images are incredibly powerful. And Jonathan Porritt, famed UK environmentalist who kindly wrote the foreword for the book, said, it's an amazing collection of images and it's a really powerful call to action. And I truly believe it is, because if people have the opportunity to witness some of the things through the images that I've witnessed, it brings it home in a very, very clear and dramatic way that the environment is changing very rapidly and not for the better. I've been really privileged to have travelled around the world and met the people that I've met and seen the things that I've seen. But, at times pretty damn depressing, because I've probably seen more images of environmental destruction than anybody else, really. Yeah, it's pretty shocking.
Have you had any experience of extreme events as well? Is the last one I wanted to ask.
Yes, certainly. The UK, for instance, has seen a whole raft of extreme weather events, mainly to do with flooding and storms. And in fact, Cumbria, the Lake District, which is my home, was absolutely devastated by Storm Desmond about 18 months ago now. And it was the greatest recorded rainfall in a 24-hour period. Something like 13 inches of rain fell in 24 hours. Thousands of homes were flooded. Landslides cut off the main road from my town to the next town for over 6 months. Hundreds of bridges were either damaged or completely destroyed by the floods. It's come knocking on my own doorstep.
To hear the Lake District has been bombarded is kind of heartbreaking, because that is, like you said, one of the most beautiful areas the UK has to offer.
It is, and millions of pounds of damage were caused by that, and yet, the UK does have a certain amount of resilience from the point of view that we are, we're quite a wealthy country. So you go to places like Malawi in Africa, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. The floods here, it's terrible that people's houses were flooded, but in most cases, insurance would kick in and, people will be able to repair their houses and the insurance would cover the bill. I documented the aftermath of the worst floods that ever hit Malawi, which is, as I say, a very poor country in Malawi. Over 1,000 people died in those floods. 100,000 people were displaced, and those people lost everything. Their houses were washed away. Their livestock was washed away. Even the soil that they depended on to grow their crops was washed away, and they were left with absolutely nothing. And no insurance companies there to help pick them back up again. The government can't afford to do a great deal, so the whole thing's just an utter disaster.
What are people like in that situation are expected to do? How do they recover from a scenario like that?
It is incredibly difficult for them to recover because, there is aid going in there. Some of the aid agencies are working there. I took flights with United Nations where they were flying Médecins Sans Frontières doctors into areas that were still cut off by the floods and, delivering food aid to them. But in terms of getting people back on their feet, it's incredibly difficult. If you're a subsistence farmer, but actually all the soil on your farm is somewhere further down the Zambezi River, it's not like you can just start farming again, because the very land that you owned just does not exist any longer, essentially.
Now, I don't want to downplay global warming or climate change, but have you had any experience or seen anywhere that has almost benefited from the increase in temperatures or ocean acidification?
I can't say that I have, no. I mean, all the things that I've seen are where the environment is degraded by things getting warmer.
So before we finish, I always ask the guests of the show if they have any messages or anything they would like to advocate in their own words. Do you have anything you'd like to say to anyone?
Yeah, I would just urge people to go out there and, sift through some of this misinformation that's currently available, and try and, really educate yourself about the impacts that climate change is already having, but the devastating impacts that are waiting down the line for us if we continue as a sort of business as usual scenario. Many areas now are starting to decarbonize, and many companies are starting to decarbonize, but we really need to ramp that up. So we need as many people as possible to get behind this, to lobby their MPs, to talk to their pension companies about divesting from fossil fuels. There's a million and one things that people can do, but we really need, people to stand up and be counted on this issue.
Beautiful advice. I would like to thank you very much for taking your time out to join us on the show. It's honestly appreciated and a great honor to have you on.
My great pleasure. Thank you very much.
But just before you go, in Australia, do you happen to have any recommendations on anywhere someone can go visit to witness these changes? Like you've mentioned before, the Great Barrier Reef. Are there any others out there?
There are. I mean, certainly, there's a lot of areas that are impacted by drought in Australia. Also, there's a lot of areas that have been catastrophically impacted by bushfires. You go to places like sorry, that's my dog howling in the background.
He's got a beautiful howl. He's great.
He's ready for his walk. You go to places like Marysville that were essentially wiped off the map by catastrophic bushfires. So there's plenty of places you can go where you can see things that are happening that are really terrible.
And that's it from us today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and I'd like to thank Ashely Cooper once more for taking his time out of his busy schedule to chat with us all. If you would like to check out Ashely Cooper's website, it will be in the description for this podcast. I'll also be placing a link to his book. I highly recommend having a look. It's got some fantastic images. If you have any questions about today's episode or would just like to chat, feel free to contact us on vaguelyaccurate@acepodcast.com. We have got a new email. I'm still active on vaguecomments@gmail, but vaguelyaccurate@acepodcast is the place to go. Don't forget to check out our website, vaguelyaccurate.com. And also, please, it really does help if you could just pop onto iTunes and rate and review us. It really, really does make us stand out more and get more listeners. So I'd like to thank you all for your time once more, and have a good day, guys.